All right, what song just started playing in your head? Well, hold that thought, because it's about to demonstrate the massive deterministic argument Freud laid down over 120 years ago in his book, The Interpretation of Dreams. Now, I've been reading this book for a while, and so far, it's exactly what the title suggests. But the whole time I've been thinking, how does this become psychoanalysis? Like, where's the clinical technique? Well, finally, at the very end, it all becomes clear when Freud demonstrates how our thoughts are predetermined by prior experiences and uses this to explain how free association works, and ends up making what is essentially an early deterministic argument against the notion of free will. So let's start with those opening lyrics and what song you heard. Now, if you were a teenager in the 80s, you likely thought of Def Leppard. That nonsense pseudo-German countdown by producer Mutt Lange is burned into your brain from all the times it played on MTV. And now, as soon as you hear it, it triggers the rest of the song to start playing in your head, even before it starts. But if you were a kid in the late 90s, you probably associated it with The Offspring, which used the same exact pseudo-German opening in their song, Pretty Fly for a White Guy. Now, regardless of whichever song you heard, your association is determined by which of those two you've had the most prior exposure to. This is what many songwriters refer to as the signature riff. It's those opening seconds of memorable sound right at the beginning of a song that instantly activates the rest of the song to start playing in your head without you even realizing it. Now, if you've never heard of either of those bands, just think of a song where like the opening few notes are instantly recognizable. So like the guitar riff from Smoke on the Water, the bass line from Seven Nation Army, or just like that hypnotic riff from Mr. Brightside. You hear 2 or 3 seconds and that's it. The rest of the song just floods in and starts playing in your head. That's the signature riff. Okay, so what does this have to do with Freud, right? Okay, well, one of Freud's most brilliant insights in this book is about how dreams can be triggered almost instantaneously by external stimuli, as if the dream were already there in the back of your mind, and something suddenly hit that play button. To illustrate this, Freud uses the anecdote of Maury's guillotine dream, in which a man named Maury is fast asleep when a piece of wood suddenly just accidentally falls and strikes him on the back of the neck, and it wakes him up. Yet somehow, in the split second between the wood hitting his neck and him waking up, Maury dreamt of like this elaborate full-length story about living through the French Revolution, being put on trial, and finally having his head chopped off by the guillotine. Okay, so like, how can such a complex dream happen in the mere instant before waking? Like, where did all that material come from? Okay, so that's where this signature riff analogy comes back in. It's exactly what Freud is describing. The wood hitting Maury's neck wasn't composing a dream on the spot. It was triggering the thoughts that were already there. The elaborate French Revolution scenario, that wasn't created in that instant. It was likely a pre-existing fantasy that like maybe Maury had daydreamed years earlier during some youthful period of romantic identification with revolutionary heroes. The physical stimulus of the neck strike just hit the play button on that track that Maury had already recorded years earlier and was wired into his psyche. Freud identifies the mind's ability to organize unconscious material as part of a broader process he calls secondary revision, which becomes especially obvious in the later stages of the dream process, where dreams get smoothed up and made more narratively coherent so that we can tolerate them without waking up in total confusion. Moreover, Freud argues that secondary revision is not a special dream power and is, in fact, the exact same mechanism our minds use every single day while we're awake. So this is also why eyewitness testimony is so notoriously unreliable. Like how multiple people can witness the same event and still walk away with very different accounts of what happened. That's because the mind is always filling in those gaps. Freud argues that during sleep, the mind simply applies that same exact dot connecting habit to our nighttime dreams. Now, this is where Freud ups the ante and starts to reveal his bigger move. That since we don't fully remember all the details of our dreams, especially when telling them to someone else, like an analyst, that we fill in the missing parts with unconscious material. Furthermore, Freud argues that this unconscious material isn't arbitrary and is, in fact, built on the same associative and predetermined material lodged in our psyche that shaped the dream in the first place. Freud argues this is exactly why an analyst can follow the chain of associations, or the linked sequence of thoughts, memories, and images that connect to one another, rather than viewing the content as random noise. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, what if the parts they remember or use to fill in the gaps are just completely wrong? Well, Freud's rebuttal to these skeptical questions hinges on one of the most foundational pillars of psychoanalysis, what he calls psychic determinism. This is the belief that nothing in the mind happens by accident. To demonstrate this, he attempts to think of a number arbitrarily and finds that you can't actually pick a number at random. So when he examines the number that came to his mind, he discovers that he can trace it back through a chain of associations to specific memories, experiences, and thoughts that determined why that particular number surfaced to his mind in place of another. It's the same basic principle as the signature riff. The thoughts that occur to you are determined by what is already there, by pre-existing experience, and none of it is truly random. Freud then offers a brilliant clinical intervention that he calls the repeat it technique. So Freud says that when a patient is telling you a dream that is overly confusing or just very convoluted, simply ask the patient to repeat it. And at the second time they explain the dream, that they'll likely almost never use the exact same words. This is because when you ask them to repeat it, the patient's internal censor, or an unconscious mechanism of resistance, realizes you're paying close attention and tries to keep the most vulnerable, revealing parts of the dream from surfacing. But by changing those specific words, the patient is unintentionally shining a massive spotlight exactly where the analyst needs to look. Now, some critics argue that this is nothing more than parlor tricks and confirmation bias. They claim that if you let someone's mind drift aimlessly, they're eventually going to stumble upon some connection where the analyst can cleverly proclaim, "Aha! We've found the hidden connection." But Freud isn't describing a trick for catching changed words. He's describing something much bigger. And it's what we now call free association. Freud argues that free association works because of a principle he stakes his entire theory on. That the chain of associations is determined, that every thought, every association, every seemingly random mental event is the inevitable product of the thoughts and experiences that came before it. So the analytic method is to take one dream element at a time and ask the patient to suspend judgment and say whatever comes to their mind freely. But he's not done yet. And this next part is where Freud gets even bolder and makes an even bigger move. Freud argues that the same thing can be done with waking thoughts to relieve mental health symptoms. Okay, now think about what this means. Up until this point, everything Freud's been arguing about psychic determinism has been about dreams, about what happens when we're sleeping. But now he's saying something bigger. He's saying the rules don't change while we are awake. The same censorship, the same displacement, those same things that distort our dreams at night are actively distorting our waking thoughts, behaviors, and symptoms during the day. And if the mechanism is the same, then the tool to dismantle and understand them should be the same too. At this point, Freud is officially moving from dream interpretation to full-scale clinical psychoanalysis. Now, in the therapy room, this means something very concrete. When a client spends 10 minutes rambling about their morning commute, complaining about the weather, or some trivial annoyance, it can feel like the session is just drifting into mindless chit-chat, right? But in Freud's view, aimless chatter does not exist. That what sounds like random noise is actually a map to the patient's deepest conflicts. I'll give you a composite example of how this might show up in the therapy room. Now, imagine a patient begins a session in a really upbeat mood, saying she's doing well while cheerfully mentioning a film she watched the night before that was set in a small coastal town in southern Italy. She wistfully explains how it brought back pleasant memories of her brief student exchange program when she had spent one semester living with a family in a small, charming village in Bavaria, before abruptly changing the subject to an argument she had earlier that morning with her supervisor at the company she works for, which is a large tech company based in Los Angeles. She felt her boss was demanding and out of touch, while also feeling unsupported by her coworkers. A few minutes later, while talking about an upcoming business trip, she casually mentioned another small town, this one from her childhood, and how her cousin had texted her a picture of what it looks like now, and how disappointing it was to see that much of the open land had been developed into strip malls. There was a brief sense of longing in her speech, but then she suddenly changed the subject again, this time to her new iPhone, and how none of her old chargers worked because they changed from the lightning port to USB-C. Now on the surface, the material sounds scattered, trivial, and completely disconnected. But through careful listening, the analyst notices and points out to her that the same chain of associations, a longing for small towns juxtaposed with the frustrations of tech and modern life, keep returning. The patient responds, it's funny you mentioned that, before abruptly dropping her cheerful, sunny disposition. She goes quiet for a few moments before finally revealing the deeper, unconscious material she had been avoiding. Profound feelings of loss, loneliness, alienation, and a longing for human connection. What looked like idle chatter was not idle at all. The mind was circling the unconscious conflict the entire time. Now, to clarify, this isn't the first time Freud has discussed free association. There were hints of it in his earlier work with Breuer. However, in that previous work, he didn't fully explain the pure technique of free association, nor did he have a comprehensive universal theory for why the patient's mind chose specific weird detours, or why the resistance behaved the way it did. But now, in 1900, this is where Freud drops the hammer, where he finally formulates the absolute law of psychic determinism. For the first time, he theorizes that the human mind is literally incapable of producing a random or arbitrary thought, and explains the exact mechanics of it, that when conscious goals are dropped, unconscious goals take over. He also introduces the mechanical explanation for how the sensor actively forces the mind to use silly, superficial associations to bypass resistance. And importantly, this is where Freud compellingly argues that our thoughts are not arbitrary and are, in fact, predetermined by our prior experiences. Now, the implications of this are huge, and I mean like gigantically huge. He is making a profound philosophical implication that's much larger than just dream interpretation or free associations. I mean, let's think about this for a second. If free association works because our thoughts are predetermined by prior events, well, then they aren't free at all, are they? I mean, there is an inherent paradox here, right? I mean, if thoughts were actually random and truly untethered from prior experience, then the analyst would just be listening to someone spout off nonsensical word salad. No amount of careful listening would lead anywhere because there would be nowhere to go. But because every single thought is anchored to a prior experience, an analyst can just grab the end of the thread and follow it backwards. Think of it like falling down a late night YouTube rabbit hole, okay? You stop searching for specific videos to watch and just start scrolling the home feed while letting your mind drift. You just start clicking whatever thumbnail catches your eye. It feels like it's completely random, right? It feels like a free wander through the internet where you get to choose whatever video you want to watch. But it isn't free at all. The algorithm is feeding you those specific thumbnails based on a massive database of every single video you've ever watched, every click you've ever made, and every second you've lingered on a screen. All of those videos being recommended to you in that home feed are the direct result of your previous viewing experiences. It's determined. Your completely free drift is actually being strictly steered by the invisible weight of your own history. In Freud's view, the unconscious mind works the exact same way. He called it psychic determinism, but what he was describing was essentially an algorithm of the unconscious mind. And because nothing mental is arbitrary, interpretation stops being a parlor trick or a guessing game, like those critics said, and becomes a real forensic method. When the patient drops their conscious control, their thoughts don't wander randomly. The deep historical algorithm of the unconscious mind feeds them the next association. The psychoanalyst is just the person sitting across from them in the room, reverse engineering the algorithm. This, in my mind, is the exact moment psychoanalysis is born as a clinical practice. Not the moment Freud interpreted the Irma dream, not the mechanisms of condensation and displacement. Those are tools and they play a huge part. But in my view, the real birth of psychoanalysis is the argument that the mind is interpretable because its productions are determined, and that what feels accidental in the mind is only accidental from the point of view of consciousness and largely illusory. But let's think about this some more. If nothing in mental life is truly arbitrary, not our dreams, not our associations, not even a number we think we pick at random, then where does that leave our ability to choose? This is where the concept of free will takes a devastating hit. Now, Freud doesn't explicitly use the phrase free will here in this book, but that is what he's dismantling. I mean, he's literally arguing that the conscious mind, the part of us that feels like it's making choices, that's steering the ship, that is acting independently, is largely an illusion. As Freud said, we are not the masters of our own house. Our choices, our words, and our behaviors are the inevitable causal products of the thoughts, traumas, and experiences that came before them. Now, Freud wasn't the first person to make this argument, okay? Thinkers like Schopenhauer and other philosophers had circled this area before. But what is truly staggering is how far ahead of his time he was when applying it to psychology. What's fascinating is that over a century later, modern scientists and philosophers like Robert Sapolsky and Sam Harris, often using extremely similar language, would arrive at the exact same conclusion: that human behavior is completely determined by prior causes, and the notion of free will is illusory. Sapolsky spent over 500 pages writing about causal chains of events in a way that is strikingly evocative of Freud's psychic determinism. And Harris, in his book titled Free Will, uses examples that are one-to-one comparable with Freud's arbitrary number example. There's podcasts of him talking about, like, pick a movie, and it's a movie you've already thought of before. So Freud didn't have Sapolsky's hard data, nor Harris's philosophical neuroscience, and he certainly didn't have access to fMRI machines. But Freud got there in 1900 with nothing but a couch and the observation that the chain of associations always leads somewhere. And by simply listening to the determined structure of our dreams and our stutters in the therapy room, he was able to map out the same deterministic reality over 120 years ago. And remember that sound clip from the beginning? How the song you thought of wasn't random at all, and that it was determined by your prior listening history? When you grew up, what you listened to, and what got wired in? Freud would say that that's how all of mental life works. And in therapy, we're just listening for the patient's signature riffs, tracking associations, and following the chain down into the unconscious. Anyway, that's all I got for you today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. My name is Vince, and I'll see you in the next one.